Let's see. Hi, everyone who's joining. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Brandy. Catriona, Hannah. Hi, Hannah.
Lindsay is somewhere there.
Josie, Katie, Lindsay. Hello.
Hello.
Hi,
Melissa.
And Melissa, Nick. Welcome, everyone. Pete, Queena, Victoria, Wendy, Wing. Welcome, everybody. We're really pleased that you're here.
Yes, we're so happy you're here. Thank you so much for coming. Sorry, I'm kind of like busy with the admitting people. So,
that's fine.
Okay, please do take note of the discount code and tweet it and let everybody know whether they're here or not. I think the problem is that now I can't see my computer anymore because I have screen share on. I also can't see my watch anymore. So we're just gonna wait until roughly 5 past until we start. Oh, Steph is here. Okay. Hi, Steph.
What time is it where everyone is? I guess some of you are in the States, aren't you? In Canada?
Yeah, exactly. Lisa, what time is it at your place?
We're at 12:04. Right after lunch. It's perfect.
And 10:05 in
yeah, it's dark here already. 5 o'clock, depressing. But I stole my daughter's ring light, so right in place up it.
So maybe I'm the earliest at 10:05, Rhiannon.
Yeah.
Yeah, you probably are.
Yeah, you probably are. Yeah.
Oh, New Mexico. Wow. 10 a.m. There you go.
Yeah, there we go. We're not alone.
Okay. I think, I mean, there's gonna be people coming in throughout. So thank you so much for coming, everyone. So I'm just gonna say a couple of words on structure. So the thing is that obviously this is all based around an edited collection, which I actually have here. There it is.
Have it too. We have to get that on the shot. There we go.
Oh, emails here. It's based on an edited collection, and the thing is with this edited collection is that it comes out of a workshop which we held in September 2018 and then met again in 2019, and we essentially discussed our varying approaches to binge watching, and this was kind of done, like the workshop essentially consisted of 18 different people, which is why you're actually seeing a lot of people from this workshop here. And the thing is, because this entire thing was based very much around collaboration. We proofread each other's work. We were in touch throughout the entire period of production and all of that. So I always find it really weird to say that this is my book or anything, because my perspective is that it's our thing. And we very much did this together, which is why it kind of seemed weird to me to say this book launch isn't a collective project as well. So what you're seeing here is actually quite a few people who authored different articles in this book. And I wanted to structure this book launch in a way where we kind of get to have a little bit of a rediscussion or a reconsideration of our own work within this. So the way this is structured is actually very much as a conversation between different workshop participants who are obviously also contributors to this book. Like I said, we kind of came together in 2018 and 2019 for this workshop with 18 people. And we kind of separated into different groups depending on our approaches in order to create different sections of this book. So we have one section on fan studies, we have one section on audience and reception studies, one section on transnational television and binge watching, and one section on textual structures. So we all very much kind of like talked in these smaller groups about what binge watching means if you're approaching it by a specific approach, and how we can design different sections of an edited collection. We actually all co-wrote the conclusions to each section together. So, well, the authors of a section co-wrote the conclusion to that section together. Again, kind of like in this spirit and emphasizing the idea of collaboration. So because our workshop did include a number of, for example, early career researchers, and because academia is kind of what it is, it also included a number of postgrad students, and we all kind of know what problems of contemporary academia can be. And so we lost some people. That's actually just what I'm trying to say. We're really, really grateful for their contributions, but quite a few people actually went off into different careers as well. So I just want to emphasize that essentially what you're seeing today from the various contributors isn't necessarily everybody who contributed in discussions to this. I'm still, I think what I'm most proud of on this collection on binge watching and contemporary television studies is actually that it's a truly collaborative edited collection. So we really, really did manage to work together. Like I said, because of that, we're all here to discuss this. So this is kind of structured as a panel discussion between contributors. And we're going to open this up to more questions in the second hour. For now, we're kind of emphasizing what each of us is talking about. I want to start by kind of going around the various contributors and having them introduce themselves and say a few words about what exactly their contribution is. I'm sorry, I just keep showing this book. So just say a few words about their approach and what their article is about. So I'm gonna start and kind of like have my gallery view on Zoom. So I'm just gonna call up the person I see first, which actually is Charlotte.
Yikes, okay, hello. I'm Charlotte Stevens and I'm a lecturer at Birmingham City University. And so my chapter is a bit of a historical thing, or quite a historical thing. So what ways are binge watching conceptualized in my piece? Really, the word doesn't appear to talk about television. 1970s, 1980s, archival work I was doing, they talk about parties, getting together, hanging out, watching a whole lot of TV together. I looked at examples where watching a lot of episodes as a group was a central part of fan activity. So I was looking at letters written between fans. Earliest I found of this kind of like intensive compressed viewing was Activity 1979. And so I was using like the loosest possible definition of binge in this, mostly just looking for people's description of their activity and then kind of like putting a later sort of frame on it all. Anything where they were like watching multiple time-shifted episodes close enough together that the letter writers themselves thought it was notable. Things like watching all night or for 6 hours, which are two separate examples from 1979. Another one from 1984, they talk about a fan convention where the video room was active from 3 p.m. Friday to 2:30 a.m. on Monday, pausing only for meals and sleep. And in another description from 1985 letter, someone talking about long hours gabbing and watching tapes as part of this activity. Or less specifically, if it wasn't like from 3 p.m. Friday to whenever, any kind of descriptions I was looking for where watching a lot of television was framed in language of excess. And I really do look forward to continuing this work and visiting other archives and seeing other fanzines that do this stuff, because I did see the word binge appear in a letter from 1985, but it wasn't about television. It was about reading a lot of stuff to support television-based or television-focused fan activity. So I just want to read more to see if that word actually does appear in the context that we all now think of it now. So that's me, that was my chapter.
Thank you, Charlotte. Actually, this is not the next person I see on my screen, but I'm still gonna go with Rhiannon next because Rhiannon is also in the fan studies section of the book.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hi, everybody. I'm a professor of women's and gender studies at Athabasca University in Canada. Yeah, so my research interests sort of coalesce around viewing and participatory fan practices and in relation to popular television. So the study that on which this chapter is based specifically looks at fanish binge watching. Which takes as its starting point the idea that there's some kind of affective relationship with the text, right? That means there's still other types of binge watching that's not necessarily fanish, and some of my contributors touch on that in their work, particularly in the next section. So I see basically binge watching as a viewing practice that's not necessarily novel. I think that's made clear by your introduction, RK, and but particularly overlaps with other established fan practices. so it may be a new term. I think Charlotte sort of suggested that, but it wasn't. I mean, the term may be new. Well, it's not new now, sort of 2013, but it's newish. But of course, it's been around, dates back decades, really, to sort of more marathons scheduled by even television broadcasters themselves with their programming, or collective rewatches of shows. So basically, binge watching until the streaming service was really overlaps then with catch up and repeat viewing. So I kind of see that as a kind of coalescence of practices together. Now with streaming services, I say Netflix, but it could be a whole bunch of them. So my work kind of focuses on that which gives the opportunity to actually, because of the release model, gives the opportunity to binge new content. And as such, creates this kind of novel overlap with anticipatory viewing as fans, which we didn't have in the past. So this particular project, to sum up quickly, looks at, I went to Reddit, and, is kind of with us, that subset of fans that likes to come to forums to discuss, do collective interpretation of television shows that they're watching. So I was looking particularly, I looked at 8, I think, during the period of time of the research that were new releases on Netflix. I did a couple of things. First, I kind of read it gives, so there were subreddits formed dedicated to these shows as soon as they were released, and just set up just before the release. So of those shows, so what I did, a couple things, I looked at comment tallies. Reddit conveniently tallies up the number of in each discussion hub and on the various threads. So I was really looking for, and I looked at them at different periods, 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours. So basically found so this is the indirect, if you like, evidence of binge watching, that most of the comments about the entire series I found from across all the shows, pretty much taking place between 48, 72 hours. Clearly, to have done that, people have had to binge the show to talk about the entire show, right? I mean, there are still episode threads, but I kind of looked at the whole one, and of course the finale. So that's the sort of indirect, but the rest of so what I did for the rest of the project is I looked at, I basically did discourse analysis. I looked at those threads specifically, and I looked for explicit statements that people made about binge watching. And I coded that into themes. So it became very clear to me that, yes, so some of the themes that come up through our book, ideas of binge watching is associated with addiction and lack of control. These kind of things were mentioned, but it was kind of in a, there was a bit of a lightheartedness about it. It was kind of like a faux guilt, if you like. But it was also really clear. So there was other themes that came up, but particularly I wanted to mention here, and I'll just be my last comment, that binge watching it was very clear to me that binge watching does not take place in a vacuum of everyday life. And so that's kind of where my work overlaps with our folks in the next section that was on audience practices. And so I could see very clearly that yes, at some moments binge watching disrupted everyday life, particularly for North Americans watching through the night. So they didn't get sleep deprivation, but they did it anyway. But then there was other cases where people really wanted to binge, but they couldn't because of constraints of everyday life. So I guess in short, binge watching needs to be understood, not in terms of just affective relations, but also domestic and household relations. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So I'm actually just going to move on to the audience section, which follows the fan studies section immediately. So Lisa, if you could start that one off.
Hi, folks. I'll be somewhat brief. I typically do qualitative research. So my chapter looks at qualitative data and also some comparative statistics. I went into a new realm for me, specifically of binge watching conditions and multitasking. That was a question or an area of study that our group really wanted to get at when we met in 2018. And so that's the section that I did. And I'm also really proud of our collaborative conclusion chapter, which is about viewer typologies. And so we looked at motives, we looked at engagement, we looked at attentiveness, and it brings together a ton of binge watching research and synthesizes it really nicely. So that's all from me.
Thank you. Amy. Yep, you.
Sorry, yeah, Emil Steiner here. I'm an assistant professor of journalism at Rowan University. Yeah, so as Lisa was saying, you know, our section of the book, which we're very proud of, focuses on audience and you know, binge viewers. And so I share in the fact that we have this typology as the sort of concluding chapter of our section, because I think what a lot of us who are researching binge watching have sort of experienced in the past few years is that binge watching has come to mean so many things, and it's become so ubiquitous that it's really difficult to sort of study it in any kind of productive way, because everything is kind of binge watching now. It's almost like where, you know, all media is kind of social now, all viewing and all watching is almost all that it is binge watching. So I think having this typology is a really important step toward moving to add nuance to this this important area of media and media consumption. So my chapter specifically was actually looking at media portrayals of binge viewers. As Lisa pointed out, you know, there's been a lot of work done that studies actual binge viewers and their rituals and their motives, and in some cases the outcomes. But there's been almost nothing done that actually looks at how the media portrays binge viewers, particularly the characters themselves. And, you know, while historically there have been plenty of portrayals of the couch potato, you know, from Archie Bunker through Lal Bundy and all of those kind of characters, the binge viewer, maybe because so many people are doing it, doesn't really lend itself to have a TV portrayal. Where you do find these sort of portrayals of binge viewers is, ironically enough, in the commercials about binge watching that were put out by streaming media companies. So I did an examination of those to see how they constructed the idea of a binge viewer right at the time, you know, around 2013, 2014, when the sort of concept of binge watching was going to the mainstream of the sort of zeitgeist. Everyone's sort of talking about it. What I found was really surprising. You know, typically when a company advertises its product or service or whatever, they want to portray the users of the product or service in a positive light. But if you look at the commercials that have binge viewers in them from like Netflix or from Hulu, you know, et cetera, you know, Amazon, Comcast, they portray them as these extreme caricatures, addicts who are completely desperate, out of control. And it's sort of a very curious thing. It's almost like if a fast food restaurant were to portray the people, the eaters of fast food, as morbidly obese and having heart attacks and, you know, and this terrible light. So, you know, it got me thinking, why would they do this? And I think what the conclusion I ultimately, you know, came to in this examination of them is that in order to sort of get binge watching and the binge viewer themselves to be out there, they needed to differentiate themselves from 20th century ideas of television as actually addictive. And so they kind of made fun of that idea. They made it sort of a kind of thing where if you actually think TV is dangerous, then you're watching bad TV. Right. And you're different if you're a binge viewer. If you're a binge viewer, you're in on the joke. You get that this is silly and poking fun at the idea of TV, you know, being potentially addictive and ruining your life. And I thought it was just a fascinating advertising campaign that was going out there, and that the way that they use sort of nostalgia and irony to kind of differentiate themselves from what TV was in order to sell a product and service of what new TV had become. So that was my chapter. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I actually can't see anybody else from the audience that is section. I do want to say, like quite a few people just couldn't make it because of other commitments, because I dare you to try to get 18 people together this late during the term. So obviously, quite a few people had other commitments, which is, however, I'm just going to move on now to the sections on transnational TV, with Bob starting us off.
All right. Hi, I'm Barb, or BG Stolz in the book, because my German name just kind of sucks for citation purposes. That being said, hey, there's statistics about this, Mareike. There is statistics. Put an umlaut in your name and you're doomed. Anyways, long story short, I'm just for a tiny little bit longer, the program director of media and communications at Coventry University before I bid England farewell. Different story. Now, for my specific chapter, I actually am a media industries political economy scholar, and I'm predominantly interested in transnational and international movements of television content. And as such, predominantly care about the shift of windowing practices in the contemporary age, which in part are directly linked to binge watching, because there's a certain shift of de- and rehabituation process of how we consume, but also how audience members and audiences themselves have been valued by the industry. As a result, I've been thinking through how content has been marketed and sold in terms of national and cultural content, because of course, Amazon, Netflix, and company function and work on a global level, or sell themselves as doing that. So I'm really kind of investigating what in this current climate of binge watching and global juggernauts, cultural and national identity means in terms of how it's branded, how it's understood, how it's used as a marketing tool as well, because especially Netflix has marketed itself as someone that brings to you a sense of global citizenship, openness for the world, and incredible tolerance, and not just with specific programming like Sense8 that a German columnist called soul communism, but also in all of their branding, such as the 6 degrees of separation advertisement they ran. But yeah, that's kind of my thing in a nutshell, looking how binge watching and the re- and dehabituation processes actually affect industry and industry signaling about national and international concepts of belonging and identity.
Thank you. By the way, when my first book came out, Amazon didn't recognize my name and always wanted to change the spelling. So that on kind of like using your names in order to publish stuff.
Yeah. It's a bit weird, but I'm going to see how this chapter goes. I'll keep back on it.
Okay, so thank you so much for that. Next up, still within the section on transnational televisions, Rob.
Hi, yes, thank you. I'm Rob Watts. I'm currently a lecturer in film and drama at University of Manchester. I was one of the postgraduates Mareike mentioned involved in this at the time when we started the workshops. And I just wanted to say how much I kind of appreciate the kind of generosity of this whole process. I feel like I've been spoiled at the beginning. You know, I'm never going to have a kind of edited collection that works quite as well as this did, or as inclusively as this did. But yeah, I really appreciated getting to work with everyone, but also with Mareike and Barb on this section, which is a great experience. But yeah, my chapter was called, or is called, National TV as Transnational Cinematic Object, How Binge Consumption Frames the Critical Vocabulary, which is kind of an unwieldy title, I know, but it's it kind of tells you what you need to know about my approach here. But I'm looking at the relationship between binge watching and popular TV criticism, ultimately how the binge watching frame can itself ease the transnational assimilation of public service dramas that are marked by this a very national, distinctly national mode of address with local specificities embedded in them. So I was looking at BBC dramas, how they're repackaged as Netflix originals in the US. So yeah, I'm looking at the idea is kind of what I'm interested in is how Netflix's encouragement of binge watching as a consumption norm lends itself to these single series reviews that I call big picture reviews in the chapter, that take the complete season rather than the individual episode as the main object of criticism. So my conception of binge watching is kind of formed through ideas of completeness versus segmentation, and trying to relate that to these familiar discourses of like the cinematic as a way to construct prestige around a given text, and how that relates, in the bingeability discourse, relates to transnational appeals of very specific, nationally specific drama. So yeah, I'm kind of arguing these big picture reviews draw on the evaluative aesthetics of film criticism more than the traditional kind of weekly episodic TV coverage of the broadcast era, where TV programs are kind of reviewed for this imagined national TV audience that's in a kind of conversation, ongoing, in progress conversation with the critic. So yeah, I feel like I'm looking at ways in which national television drama, TV drama aesthetics from a transnational perspective, ways in which national TV drama does or doesn't travel, how the nationally and culturally specific elements are kind of valued and framed within a transnational exchange as authentic or obstructive, so on. So my approach was some textual analysis, but mainly a critical reception study of the two shows that I was looking at, which were Happy Valley and The Fall, both of which have these sort of distinctly national elements, but were reframed as Netflix originals. So yeah, I won't go through, I'll try and keep it brief on the findings, but basically the singular big picture framing, review frame, I found through an analysis of these different kinds of reviews, tended to suppress or simplify local and nationally specific details, with the critic functioning as a kind of tour guide for the prospective viewer, sort of shaping and framing their experience of difference, and using the idea of bingeability to kind of mediate that and suggest that this world, this slightly different exoticized world, is maybe an experience worth immersing yourself in. So I use this idea of the tourist gaze to kind of to frame my reception analysis here, whether the enjoyment of the trip is worth the kind of obstructive details that you will find them in. And yeah, it's a very sort of, it's a very narrow case study that I've got. There's a particular moment where Netflix were acquiring dramas from public service broadcasters and trying to use them to bolster their originals, their slate of originals. And I think lots have changed since, but I think in looking at how reviews change through the idea of the binge watching frame, I hope is valuable in looking at some of the ways in which binging as a distribution frame ripples out to prestige discourses of legitimation in TV, and ideas of things like cultural discount, cultural markup, ideas about what does and doesn't travel. So that's the kind of general concerns of my chapter. I'll sort of stop it there before I ramble.
Thank you so much. So I was also in this section on transnational television. I looked particularly at Netflix and genre discourses. So particularly at sex education and how to sell drugs online fast as transnational dramas, and the way that Netflix kind of uses genre frameworks in order to formulate a version of transnationalism, and kind of like tries to translate transnational culture via its series, which in many respects, because it's Netflix, it can be a bit complicated, largely because the transnational culture that Netflix encourages is for obvious reasons at the expense of national culture, which links in quite well with the concepts that Barb talks about and the concepts that Rob talks about in terms of transnational reception. So I'm just gonna leave it at that, and I'm going to move on to the last section on the textual structures of binge watching, and I'm going to ask Tom to go first here.
Okay, hi everyone, can you hear me? Yeah?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So echoing what Rob said, I was also one of the postgrads that was allowed into the project. That sounds terrible. Allowed. I recently completed my PhD at Warwick, and I'm doing some teaching there at the minute. And my chapter kind of grew out of this research that I was doing about streaming comedy television. My approach is quite text-based, which is probably due to my time at Warwick. They're sort of known for that kind of thing. I'm sorry, I have a terrible cold at the minute. You might usually think that people binge watch comedy for reasons different to drama television. It's more of a comfort thing as opposed to narrative. They're not, dying to see what's going to happen in the next episode of something like Breaking Bad. It's just you want to watch whole seasons of The Office or Parks and Rec, which I know is something that I was doing in lockdown. But and others presumably. But the two shows that I look at in my chapter, which let me just find the name of it because it's been so long. Yeah, next episode in 5, binge watching a narrative in a streaming television comedy. The two shows that I look at in my chapter are cases where I think binging can be related to the ways in which the shows are structured narratively. It grows a little bit out of Marika's own writing on Arrested Development, which is one of the shows that I also look at. And I basically argue that there's a way of approaching comedy on streaming television that foregrounds narrative and encourages binge watching and even allows comedy to emerge in the process of binging. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask Orchan to go next.
Hi. So yeah, I'm just gonna piggyback on Rob and Tom and just repeat the sentiment that I was also very lucky and fortunate to be here, and I indeed am also spoiled by this experience. So anything less than that, I think I'll just throw a tantrum. Just a heads up for any other edited collections. So what?
You have right? You have a for your edited collections instead of. Sorry, go ahead.
Exactly. So yeah, much like Tom, my chapter sort of grew out of my PhD research as well, although it did get a little bit sidetracked, which was good. Because when I first started with my PhD, I was sort of hoping, very naively thinking that I was going to do autoethnography about binge watching. So I was just going to watch Scrubs and Gilmore Girls and Buffy all the time, and I don't know, maybe keep a diary. And of course no one bought it. They were like, no, we're not gonna let you do that. So I was like, fine, then I'll just try to do a model about narrative theory of Netflix, and that will teach them. So that's where it sort of came from. I came up with a model called serial televisual narrative analysis model, which was a way to try to see a whole season together narrative-wise, so that when we sort of spread out that spreadsheet, we would be able to find the points between each episodes. And the idea was that maybe that would tell us a little bit about why some narratives are more bingeable than others, because maybe, the patterns show us something like that. And the chapter here was a sort of a pilot case for it, looking at two Gilmore Girls, the broadcast version, and the 4-episode Netflix version, Gilmore Girls, A Year in the Life, to see if they were narratively at the same level of bingeability. But then as I was doing this, a lot of discussion about televisual afterlives and how sort of shows, when they go into an SVOD environment for their afterlives, change a little bit, got into it, which does sort of excite me a little bit, because it then turned into a full chapter in my thesis too, with different case studies. So yeah, in a nutshell, it's just trying to do a formal structural analysis of 2 Gilmore Girls and talk a little bit about televisual afterlife in Netflix.
Thank you so much. So Tanya and Julia actually co-authored an article. So I'm hoping you might be able to actually talk about it a little bit together, or one of you goes first, or I'm kind of going to leave this a little bit up to you.
Can I go first?
We should say every other sentence first. Sorry, go on.
Yeah,
maybe
okay.
not. No, I'm just joking. Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, thanks, Marika. I'm Tanya Horrick. I'm an associate professor in film and media at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. And just want to say again that this was a wonderful experience and we had great fun together. You remember, Lisa? They flew you over and it was fantastic. And I'll never forget Orkin's expressing his passion for Gilmore Girls in the pub for a few hours. Yeah. That was great. Anyways, my chapter, as Marika said, or our chapter rather, because I co-wrote it with the wonderful Julia, is called Netflix Feminism, Binge-Watching Rape Culture in Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt and Unbelievable. And in this chapter, we look at the extent to which Netflix's bingeable programming strategy and its effect on serialized narrative structures opens up new avenues for interrogating rape culture in popular storytelling. And this is a subject that I've been interested in for a while, like how do these shows designed for binge watching, how might they open up new ways or not of depicting sexual violence and trauma, etc. So I've written about this before in relation to 13 Reasons Why and sex education. And then since we've written this chapter, I May Destroy You came out, which is another show that explores sexual violence across the course of, and interrogates rape culture across the course of several episodes. And as I've said elsewhere, what's interesting is that Michaela Cole did not want I May Destroy You to be released in a bingeable format. She wanted to have it just released on a weekly basis because she argued that binge watching, she doesn't like binge watching. She doesn't like the way you sort of can watch all these episodes all at once. And she felt that I May Destroy You was the kind of show that needed to have a break between episodes so that you could process the traumatic storyline. However, many people do and have binge watched I May Destroy You. So I think it's quite interesting to think about the different ways of looking at that and how for some people like self-directed viewing, like watching as many episodes as they feel they can in a sitting might be a way of dealing with the trauma. And I think I'm interested in how a bingeable narrative, like how watching several episodes all at once might change the way in which we're relating to the depictions of sexual violence on screen. So these are quite complex questions. And I guess the other feature of our article, Julia, which maybe you can speak to as well, is like how we're interested in Netflix and how it presents itself as being like a woke platform, and how we came up with this idea of Netflix feminism to talk about how it presents shows like Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt and Unbelievable as part of its feminist remit. Don't know if you have anything to say about that, but.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Tanya. Right, so my name is Julia Havas. I started out, so when we started on this work together, I was just coming out of my PhD, where I was basically looking at how American television sort of instrumentalizes feminism, feminist discourses in its quote unquote quality programming. So that was my kind of, so it basically was a feminist TV studies background that sort of I came from and I still am in. And I was thinking through how this sort of television, American television is using certain sort of political discourses to sort of speak to or try to sort of develop this kind of cultural value of scripted TV. And when we started to work on this with Tanya, I was thinking through how Netflix was basically doing something similar, but it also nicely sort of speaks to the themes of sort of a genre and comedy specifically, because I was looking at Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. So what Rob was talking about, and also what Marika's also investigating in terms of how Netflix is kind of doing this, self-promotion of we are being different from television, but are you really kind of discourse, and how the binge watching phenomenon is instrumental or basically feeds into this. So at the time in my PhD, I was looking at among many other shows, I looked at Orange is the New Black, and how at the time, so around 2013, 2014, Netflix was very heavily pushing this idea of this show is so iconoclastic, it's so sort of breaking down barriers between different genre categories and so on. And so I was really interested in how it's kind of tried to speak to the times of, you know, the Me Too movement and so on. And so basically that's how, that's we sort of started this conversation with Tanya, and thinking through basically this sort of how the narrative structures are kind of geared toward this. We call it now, we could probably theorize the concept of wokeness a bit more now, because there's lots of writings coming out. At the time, we didn't really have that much, so basically we looked at this from the perspective of how rape culture is narrativized. And I'm still really, as Tanya was also saying, we are still really thinking through this in terms of how, so binge watching is now doesn't seem to be so fashionable anymore as a kind of term to self-promote or promote streaming. There's now, obviously HBO is still doing, and then Apple TV also are doing a sort of weekly release, and how that kind of different kinds of distribution models and release models are now instrumentalized to sort of also speak to a certain kind of, you know, progressivism or what have you, which is always, you know, it's almost like cyclical. I find these kinds of promotions of these televisual strategies or you know, streaming strategies. So I'll probably stop there, because there could be lots being said about that, but yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. By the way, I also want to point out that Tanya just put the link to Julia's book in the chat, which I think is
Thank you, Tanya.
That's so out, right?
It's due to come out in March, but I'm doing the indexing, so I do hope that I can finish by the time it should come out.
We're all definitely very much looking forward to it. I kind of want to go on a little bit into a sort of panel discussion among us. One of the things that is obviously quite interesting about this book is that the workshop happened in 2018 and 2019. And the world suddenly looked very different in 2020. While we were kind of like finishing this book, like first lockdowns came in. So I think it was about in March 2020. So some people kind of like got a small mention in some contexts that just honestly didn't make a lot of sense. I would argue we probably already still don't quite know what kinds of implications COVID and lockdowns are going to have, but obviously for our research, for us looking at binge watching, COVID does play kind of a role. So I would ask people to kind of share their impressions on what COVID has actually changed and what maybe has stayed the same here within this discourse.
Well,
did you want us to go in a particular order, or just put hands up, or what?
I was kind of like gonna go along this with a kind of loose structure. But since you're already speaking, I think Rhiannon is probably a good place to start on this.
Oh, okay. Well, sure. Well, I haven't actually done any research on, like, other empirical, any kind of empirical research or discourse analysis. However, I do have a couple of thoughts about it, and I've done a little, anecdote good anecdotal research. But I find it interesting. I mean, of course, the talk generally seems to be that COVID explosion in binge watching, that's the popular discourse, right? That there's somehow people have all this time to watch all this extra television. I guess those general discourses are somewhat problematic because they construct the home as a site of leisure, right? And then now it's going to, and the idea is that it's displacing all these other sites of leisure because of lockdown or personal illness and things. So I think we have to interrogate that a little because, of course, the house also becomes, for many people, a site of work in a different kind of way. I mean, I've always worked from a home office, but that's not true of others. And that means there's all sorts of other balancing of life, particularly for women, and child minding and schooling. So in some ways, I might think that, there'd be even, possibly less opportunities to binge watch. So I think we need to kind of think about that public discourse critically. I did look around on Reddit, since that's where I did this particular study. It was kind of hard to find direct references to binge, to COVID and binge watching. The only thing I kind of found, couple of things in general conversation, the Our Television subreddit, with things like people, I had a comment that, somebody had added Disney Plus to the sense of getting more streaming services to fill the time. But particularly if they were spending their time with this new service watching The Simpsons. And they said, and it was very much nostalgia viewing. I haven't seen this since I was a kid. Now I'm rewatching. So then I did a kind of more general search just before we had this chat. Again, it wasn't specific to COVID, but there was a thread on Ask Reddit, or hey, what are people binging, right? It was on an Ask, which is a fairly large forum on Reddit. There was like well over several thousand responses, but I scrolled through them and it was really interesting. So this is about a month ago. So yes, we see Squid Game, but almost all of it, and it was fascinating to me, was nostalgia, it was catch up for some people, never saw us, everything, you name it. There was no specifics for genre. The Office, The Simpsons I already mentioned, 6 Feet Under, The Sopranos. And again, people are like, never got a chance to see this. Now I'm watching it because I have this service. And then other comments, but particularly very much, this is my 4th rewatch. So it was all about catch up and rewatch, right? There was a few, also this timing, what was actually released new at that moment, right? And Squid Game comes up, but honestly, most of it was nostalgia or, that's a great one to watch. And so I see, again, that just falls into established fan practice, but then having technology to not just pull up buying sets of DVDs, but actually it's all happening on streaming services. So that's my observation about COVID.
I think that's kind of an interesting point, though, this idea of nostalgic viewing, which I think is also quite relevant in order to COVID because in 2020, obviously, production kind of dialed back in many respects. So that these companies often put a huge emphasis on nostalgic viewing as well, and using it to promote themselves. I'm kind of just going to step back a little bit now. Sorry, I had to say that. I'm going to step back a bit more and kind of go more into moderation. So I've got Tanya, I've got Charlotte, I've got Emil, and then Tom, and then Bob.
Oh, I'm up?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I think in the UK context, I was quite interested in this shift from Netflix being seen as sort of this guilty pleasure, this negative thing, to during COVID, people were being encouraged to stay at home, to not go out. And so there was this shift in the discourse, the way in which binge watching was talked about in the public domain. It's stay home, binge watch for Britain. Stay home, this is a great time, not a great time, but you have this time where you can just sit on the couch. That's all you have to do. And you can keep healthy and you can protect other people. So suddenly binge watching became recast as a civic duty. So I'm quite interested in that shift. And then you see the emergence not the emergence of kind TV, because comfort TV has always been around, but there was like sort of a new intensity to it. So people watching things like Schitt's Creek and Ted Lasso, like, I'm curious, do you guys think that Ted Lasso would have received the success that it has done if it wasn't for the pandemic? Maybe not. But yeah, so I was quite interested in that. And then I was also interested in the shift that happened to this idea that binge watching could be connected to social justice struggles. So when George Floyd was murdered, that was during lockdown, everyone watched that collectively in horror. And then after that, you have those lists emerging of like shows to binge watch, like anti-racist shows to binge watch. Become a social activist. So I was also interested in that moment. Yeah, so I think it was an interesting period to see how binge watching was framed and talked about in the public domain, COVID-19. And maybe I'll just stop there and let other people come into the conversation.
Yeah, Charlotte?
Yeah, I'm actually really happy because Tanya mentioned one of the things I was going to suggest, like the depathologizing of it. Some of the stuff that Rhiannon and I found in our studies is that ironic, oh, it's an addiction, oh, look, I'm so cool because I've got this bad habit. And that just kind of dropped away. It's like, it's normalizing, this is what we do now. But also, to pick up on the comment about production dropping off, not if you watch a lot of Asian television, because there were obviously different nations and different national production contexts were operating in different circumstances. So if you watch a lot of Chinese or Korean television, there wasn't really a drop off in that production. So it almost became easier to shift your geographical focus if you're already kind of into that stuff, which I remember between the first and second workshops, I actually got totally obsessed with Chinese television. I remember like yelling at Rhiannon for like an hour ago, like, oh my God, you gotta watch this stuff. And here's all the non-Netflix streaming platforms you can use. But another thing I want to bring into this discussion is the idea of the watch party being digitally co-present, either pressing play at the same time because you've all got the same streaming service, or using Watch Together or Cosme or Vicky's own, Viki.com is an Asian-focused platform, uses fan subtitling. It's a massive thing. And using their own new watch party thing to get a bunch of people together to be geographically separate, but temporally aligned, and creating event television where you watch 2 or 3 episodes together to kind of bring in both that, like, all the different ways we've talked about how you would watch TV into kind of like this meld or a new variant, perhaps. Sorry. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm bringing into the extending. Rhiannon was saying, like, reframing the domestic space as sites of work and sites of leisure, but also we might also need to think about reframing a conceptual space of where and when do we watch TV, and how do we think of our living room extending into living rooms and other time zones as we hit play together and share on a text chat.
Thank you. By the way, I do want to point out there's a chapter in the collection by Deborah Castro and Lothar Mikos, and both of them aren't here. But they actually did already write about binge watching and being co-present before the pandemic. So largely people were like living far away from their families, and they were like trying to synchronize viewing via the phone and so on, which I find really, really interesting in terms of like, well, a lot of these themes, even though they became a lot more urgent in the pandemic, a lot of them in many respects were actually present beforehand. So sorry, next person is Emir.
Hi there. Yeah, such an interesting conversation. And Orkin, whatever you're drinking, I'm jealous because it's like noon here, 1 o'clock in the USA. One thing that I think, first of all, Rye Pierce Grove, who was also one of our co-authors, she put out an article in USA Today actually examining what people were binge watching during the pandemic. Which I thought, and it touched on some of the things that we've already mentioned in terms of nostalgia viewing, also comfort viewing. I actually, during the pandemic, had my students keep viewing diaries of what they were binge watching during this time. It was actually in a sports journalism class, because the big question was, what do people who normally are tuning into sports going to watch when there's no sports to watch? And yeah, a lot of it was this sort of catch up, this sense of, wow, I've been told I have to watch The Sopranos since I was a kid, and now I finally have the time to sit down and watch The Sopranos. But I think there was also this kind of the sort of comfort binging that comes with the nostalgia of a show that you've had before that can take you back to a time when things were not as nerve-wracking as like having to, like we did, wash our groceries before bringing our mail before bringing the house during those initial terrible days of the pandemic. So I think a lot of rebinging of shows that could transport us back to that feeling of safety and sort of security were important. I also think, and no one's brought it up yet, but Tiger King, I think, was probably the most binge watched thing during at least this summer of 2020. And that show, again, I'd love to hear your all opinions on it, but that for me felt like a show where people were sort of like, wow, life is really hard, but at least we're not that, right? At least we're not like that world. So I think the seeking of comfort, and Rye writes about this, and Lisa, I know you've written about this too in the past, but the use of binge watching in a sort of therapeutic sense of making yourself feel a little bit better through it.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the points Tanya also makes is that kind of like we started out with this relatively mean thing of Tiger King, and you saw really, really mean memes around it, and like the discourse was very much around, oh, you're back. You can actually speak for yourself now.
Put some pizzas in the oven for the kids, but I'm back in the room. And I was listening the whole time I was doing that to everything Emil was saying. So yeah, I mean, I think Tiger King was an interesting moment. That was like at the beginning of lockdown, wasn't it? And it was like really like, it's the opposite of kind TV. It's cruel TV. And people bonded through watching it, and they bonded through the memes, like poking fun at cultural others. So yeah, I think that seems like a significant moment for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Bob.
I guess something has added, the Ted Lasso thing. I think if we keep thinking of contemporary viewership as something that has our experience, that could be tricky. And I'm just saying that because if we are thinking of Ted Lasso being reacted to the way it has because we're in a dire moment right now, all of my students know no other thing but post 9/11 world, which has been talked about direly all the time. So I'm not sure that that comparison necessarily to think through comfort television works as much. Also, I mean, there's like 24 wars fought at any moment in time anywhere on the planet. And I think we are hyper aware since the 80s of that. I mean, I was 6 years old when Chernobyl happened, and I'm not sure that our world has ever been as rose-colored as we like to think of it in nostalgic terms anyways. So I think Ted Lasso would have always had that effect because the world is a bit crap. Okay, that's for your happy Friday thoughts. But in terms of what was said of nostalgia and how the current moment may have influenced that, I'm working on a project about the televisual Heimat. So this notion that in the 80s and 90s, in that specific case study I'm looking at right now, a lot of transnational and international television consumption has reshaped how we consider ourselves to belong and what cultural and international pathways we belong to. Because for a lot of us, probably not native English speakers in native English television markets, but for a lot of us elsewhere in the world, most of our television consumption and the 80s and 90s are where television hits almost every pocket of the planet most heavily in terms of exploding programmable hours, has had their experience on television brought to them by foreign forces, if you so will. And I think that the current moment is not all that different from that particular decade of programmable hour explosion. The intensity of choice, the overall dread a lot of places on the globe feel now versus feeling in the early 90s, not that dissimilar to an extent. And I think that the nostalgic way, you know, when we say that we kind of include on the back end watching shows that are heralded as being amazing for their times, like The Sopranos came up several times now as identified by people that had never watched it, that they would want to watch it now and took the time to watch it, how these notions of what they should have watched and what should be part of their cultural belonging, their cultural memory, their cultural habit is. I think that is something that is being reshaped now as much as it was when all of these individual cultural national pockets were hit with all that foreign content. And so Disney Plus, it does matter that every new streamer, it does matter what catalog and what package they enter in various markets with, but Disney Plus here is a very different offering from Disney Plus in the United States, from Disney Plus in Canada, from Disney Plus in Tanzania. And I think television studies at large has a very far way to go to really acknowledge that openly and continually in all of the research that's being done. Yeah, okay, I'll shut up now.
Thank you. No, but I think it's a really, really important point to make that, like, obviously, first of all, television doesn't look the same everywhere you are. And obviously the audience, how they're actually consuming something is something that's really, really difficult to know. I'm just gonna hand over to, I actually don't know whether Tom or Lisa was first. And Tom, apparently. Okay, Tom, let's go.
Yeah, just a few ideas that have popped into my head listening to people talk for the last hour or so. So this idea of the afterlife, which Ocean mentioned, and then this thing about nostalgia and rewatching, which Rhiannon brought up. That's like gone through the roof during COVID. And sometimes I think it's due to things that would have happened anyway, like the Sopranos movie came out and it's caused this huge resurgence and people being interested in the Sopranos. And then other times it's things being added to libraries, which we've spoken about, like Seinfeld has just been added to Netflix across the world, I think. So that's now on like its 100th life. The Ted Lasso thing's interesting because it was released weekly back when the first season came out as well, I think. And the general sense that I got was that it wasn't being watched on a massive level. It wasn't a sensation until that season was over nearly. At least I didn't get into it until near the end of the first season. And now you see, you know, all of the Emmy wins and the stars on talk shows and stuff. That wasn't really happening so much last summer. And the second season has been huge, but because of this weekly release, we've had to make a choice as viewers about whether we want to watch it weekly and, you know, slum it like in the olden times, or just wait for it all to build up to binge, which I think I know some of you might have done as well. So I'd have to find the time to do closer study on this, but I am interested to see whether this second season is constructed narratively as a show which works best once a week, like, you know, you get your little dose of happiness, or whether, you know, you could binge it all in one go and get a big lots of happiness. Anyway, that's me.
Thank you. So, by the way, thanks for pointing it out. I think, Bob. Welcome, Lothar. Thank you very much for joining us. We're already in the middle of the discussion on kind of like how COVID-19 changed Thanks for joining us. He's apparently finished teaching now. I think next is Lisa, by the way.
Yeah, I just wanted to pull on a couple of threads that were mentioned earlier, and one that I don't know if we've covered a ton, but one of the key points I think about with COVID and binge watching is there's newfound respect for the need for escapism, that it's a legitimate or critical, crucial need. Sometimes you need to just pass the time in an enjoyable way. And I would also say with, I think Rhiannon was talking about this, but these spaces, domestic spaces for binge watching, I don't know if households and spaces have been reconfigured because of binge watching, but I'm in my guest room that I painted a cheery yellow so I could do work and not feel terrible about sitting in this room for hours. And I think from my chapter, one of the surprise findings was that instead of using mobile devices to binge watch kind of on the go while commuting, sometimes at work, people were most likely to bring their computers, their laptops, their iPads into the bedroom to binge watch. And I think COVID's probably only exacerbated that. Our one household TV is that site for nostalgia and family viewing usually. And then the laptops are the, what am I watching? Morning show. Thanks for mentioning that too. That's when I take the laptop and reward myself, with watching an episode of that's just come out. So those domestic spaces have been reconfigured in some ways. And I think with nostalgia, it's such a strong theme in part, and maybe this is part of the unconscious, but I watched a bunch of old 80s and 90s comedies that I loved, and some I showed to my kids. And it's a reminder of things change, and they change gradually. The pandemic forced things to change more quickly, but this nostalgic longing for what once was, it's kind of a falsehood. There were so many offensive comedies that we saw, and a couple we had to turn off because I didn't remember them being so, racist or sexist or just vulgar. And it's just a reminder, I think, that change can be good, and sometimes it's abrupt and painful, but we can embrace that process.
Thank you so much, Rob.
Yeah, I'm afraid I still want to pick up on the Ted Lasso thing, but connected to some of what Lisa was just saying, but also what Barb was saying about how it may have always happened, and it may have always found an audience because it's always that sort of thing is always an antidote to a certain kind of cynicism or the world is horrible. But I'm less interested in whether or not. I am interested in whether it works as a binge versus a weekly thing, but I'm kind of interested in the way it became this prestige show for a while, and how prestige was constructed around Ted Lasso through the Emmys and through think pieces in all the usual kind of, the Guardian and your Vulture and your establishments that would normally spend most of their time on the other kind of prestige drama, the kind of quality TV version of that tends to be a bit more dark themed. So I wondered if that moment of comfort viewing being in the discourse so much at the beginning of lockdown, we all kind of went back to nostalgia, to old sitcoms, to things that made us feel good, kind of created something in the cultural conversation that was like, we must talk about the value of comfort now. And then Ted Lasso's success isn't necessarily to do with whether it's bingeable or not. It's to do with a decentering of an idea of prestige that was all about dark themes and reality and confronting the harsh realities of the world. We didn't want that for a while. So I think comfort became bigger in the prestige conversation for a while. And I would read Ted Lasso's success through that lens. It's related to binge watching, but I think it's not easily map-onable about whether it should be or shouldn't be binge watched. Anyway, it's just a thought that occurred to me.
No, but it's quite interesting to kind of view that also with the conversation around nostalgia and kind of how things change or don't change. I remember I think I had one podcast where somebody always kept saying, I can't meet new people right now. So because of that, I'm returning to fictional characters I already know. Which, probably kind of ties in with all of that, and then kind of like branding discourses obviously picking up on this idea of, okay, let's frame this show in a different way than we probably would have in other times. Julia?
Yeah, thank you. Just following up on all these discussions on Ted Lasso. Sorry, everyone who doesn't like Ted Lasso. Well, yeah, it's an interesting kind of case. Maybe somebody should organize a conference. Anyway, so I just wanted to say that it's interesting how. So I think Ted Lasso really fits into this mode of the nice TV or nice comedy trend, which in my book really in the sort of post-millennium really started with the Parks and Recreation, which itself kind of was positioned as a kind of backlash to or response to the kind of the cringe comedy and the quality cringe comedy. And I remember that in the press at the time, it was really kind of presented as a kind of showdown between Tina Fey's type of sort of 30 Rock's sort of cruel comedy and Amy Poehler's nice comedy, and that also, I mean, the whole thing goes back to, excuse me, even to probably the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which at the time in the 70s was marketed as a war comedy. That was the kind of sort of press label that was used, the war comedy, and also it was the first really kind of comedy that was marketed as quality television. So it's kind of, it has this own kind of big kind of a story, which also fits into sort of nostalgia television. So that's also one of the things I wanted to mention. The other thing, it was just a kind of more of a question than a sort of a contribution really. It's just, I'm wondering how, talking about how COVID changed binge watching, now sort of stepping, it is a step ahead, but how television and streaming TV will and is already depicting the COVID era and this sort of whole, which we already see many shows coming out talking about the second season of The Morning Show, and there was The Good Fight, I remember, which is also interesting because it's a streaming series, weekly streaming series again. How television and streaming culture will depict, it's a typical kind of hall of mirrors kind of thing, right? How television is going to depict its own usage in a specific era of whatever we call it, a crisis. So that's just a, I don't know, question that I'm wondering recently. There's been also, it's interesting how, as it already been mentioned, how traditional, quote unquote, traditional television and sort of daytime TV already engaged probably sooner than streaming TV for various reasons has engaged with this. But yeah, that's just something that I'm really interested in considering in the future for research maybe.
Thank you so much. I also am kind of, I know like people are already looking at the chat. I did there was one comment from Jacqueline, which I wanted to pick up on a little bit, or ask some of you to pick up on in a minute, which is kind of like the question of, is Ted Lasso really framed as a prestige series, or like in what ways, as far as branding goes? My kind of thinking was also, yeah, I mean, it might actually just be the Twitter discourse in that relationship. So first Rhiannon and then Orchin.
Well, maybe I should go. I'm not going to comment directly. I was going to shift a little bit from Ted Lasso. So do you want to finish that and then come back to me?
Yeah, okay, because Orchin has Felix.
Yeah. So come back to me when we're wrapped up. I've got another direction I want to take us.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I really didn't want to clog the roundtable too much, but this is just to talk about Jacqueline's comment. So I think it's a very strong case for Ted Lasso being prestige TV, because so far we haven't really seen Apple TV Plus do anything that is not at least framed as prestige TV. So, and it is quite interesting for me because you can almost see the same, I don't want to say color palette, but almost the same color palette between like the morning show and Ted Lasso and some like Mythic Quest and See, you know, all looking very beautifully Apple-like colors on your Apple screens and everything. And especially with the second season, with the with much longer running times that are frequently on 50-ish minutes, we can absolutely see how the sets expanded with everything. I think there is a very strong case that it has been conceived as a prestige TV and not just, you know, not just a sitcom or anything. So yeah, that was just to reply to that comment.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's a point to be made there, especially about the second season. Sorry, now Rhiannon is talking.
Okay, well, I'm going to confess, read about, never seen Ted Lasso, putting it on the list, okay? But I actually want to talk about, it's obviously part of the COVID era. I want to talk about Squid Game. I think it's really interesting in terms of our collection, because particularly going back to comments that, you know, the idea that Netflix and of course other streaming services, but Netflix in particular talks about itself being a global transnational network. And so how does something like, and beside all the algorithms, suddenly Squid Game becomes the most popular show on Netflix, you know, blows past Stranger Things. So I was just going to turn to my own research. I kind of thought, well, let me just go back to Reddit and look up Squid Game. I had included the last season that was released, season 5 of Stranger Things, just caught the end of my data collection period. So I had, you know, 20,000. I mean, it just blew away all the other shows I was looking at in that year. I had something, I just made a little note here, 9,000 comments on the series after 48 hours. There were 20,000 comments on 5 days. It was just incredibly, it has 600,000 subscribers. Well, I went to look at Squid Game. This is just Reddit, right? Only 126,000 subscribers, you know, the comments for the whole season have 2,200, not outstanding in any way in comparison to the other shows I looked at, which are nowhere, you know, including, you know, BoJack Horseman and Big Man, you know, like it's really interesting. So, and in the end, there's, I guess, 4,000 towards the season finale. So that makes it one of the bigger ones. But I just found, isn't that interesting how Redditors and that particular subgroup, we could talk about who's on Reddit. Obviously, I'm not suggesting it, but that's my point. So it just shows how tacit into relief is how just not transnational that audience is. And just that popularity is not captured, right? So I'm really interested, particularly transnational folks in that section. I'm really interested, Barb particularly, I mean, because you had comments about the migration of foreign comment in your article. I'm just really interested in what the rest of you were thinking, particularly on that. And to me, it doesn't even seem to have been predicted by the algorithm. It seems to have surprised Netflix as much as anyone else. So is that okay? Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So any comments on transnationalism, Asian TV? I mean, we've had comments on transnationalism and Asian TV. So I'm kind of looking at Charlotte right now.
Sorry, also I think a bit of a chat in the DMs about Asian TV. So hello, yes. The one thing I enjoyed about reading Rob's chapter actually was just recognizing in that transatlantic discourse of British TV in the US, just how much that happens when Korean shows in particular are then put on Netflix as well, because you have some like Squid Game, which are shorter episode runs, more of like the Netflix short series version of things. But then there are so many others that are also branded as Netflix originals, which aren't the co-productions. And they have the similar kind of distribution rights there. So it's interesting, I guess, to see how the things that we've talked about, we've researched, and that are in this book can be applied fairly, like we can see that Netflix does the same thing, looking in a different direction. And I do confess I sort of missed the start of that conversation, so that's my small contribution, riffing off of the main theme.
Thank you so much. Bob, did you want to comment on that?
Maybe only that if you're looking at movements of content that, I mean, this particular market, right, has increased globally significantly, especially with young adults. So that's one thing to note. The second thing to note is that Netflix has been pushing aggressively several Asian countries' contributions, not necessarily in whole shows, but in characters, themes, and cultural specificity across their locally commissioned content, right? So not the content that they buy and license that's already made, but the ones that they specifically commission for their, well, for their platform. God, I hate terminology these days. Everything is like pitfall. But anyways, long story short is they have, so Netflix itself has targeted that market by increasing more of the conversations, but then also there has been for over a decade now a steadily growing market for especially Korean, but also Hong Kong. So I think Hong Kong and Korea are kind of the forerunners into English language markets, but a lot of the other Southeast Asian content, of course, anime, Japanese anime, not to forget, but I'm talking about more drama here. They've been pushing in for ages. And I think that in terms of binge watching and the streamers, what has happened is that they have increased dubbed content accessibility. And I think that's the key difference here that opens up markets to begin with. I'm not sure that the algorithm is really that surprised, but I don't think the algorithm is necessarily identifying success in that way, by the way. I think if you're looking at quantum theory, so how, and I mean the quantum theory that Netflix named itself as such, is all about identifying elements in each specific show and how they can, through thumbnails, be advertising that show to unlikely viewers, right? So when you or I or people that are invested in and understanding genre conceptions go, how could the algorithm tell me that I'm interested in that? They know nothing. It's a faulty algorithm. It's because we think it's actually looking at what we want. No, it's looking at the thumbnails will give away why they think that they can potentially get you to watch and engage. Just like a rethinking of what the algorithm does for Netflix. So more of an industrial logic behind it.
Thank you. So, Rob?
This is not so much about the algorithm, but just about Squid Game in general. It's one of those things that occurred to me while Barb was talking about dubbing and language. So I don't really know where, when I start talking, where this is going to end. So I might, but it's in terms of, in my chapter, I was looking at how authenticity becomes an issue with local language that's designed, dialogue that's written, designed not to have cultural references that aren't necessarily accessible to foreign audiences, and how that can actually just scan as a kind of cultural authenticity that is valued by the foreign program adopters that Barb writes about. But with Squid Game, I thought there was something really interesting in the translation aspect of it. I don't know if anyone saw the kind of controversy over the subtitling and how the subtitling was linked to the dubbed version, which was seen by those who understood the original Korean as losing a lot of the meaning of the dialogue. And then there was this discourse about authenticity of Netflix foreign programs when they come from the dub versus when they come in the original. And I know you probably know more about the politics of dubbing, Marika, than I do. So I don't really have an endpoint to this thought, but it struck me as relevant to what my chapter does, but also what Barb was just saying.
Yeah, Charlotte?
Just because on the idea of authenticity and that the subtitling and the Netflix getting it wrong, it's actually a well-known fact amongst those of us who watch too much Korean and Japanese television on Netflix, that the honorifics that are used get flattened from the spoken language into what we see in the subtitles in English. But the interesting thing is, as you become more familiar with the sounds of the language, you can hear the honorifics that come through. And there's an interesting thing where you kind of accept that there's a level of access being provided in the subtitles to broader narrative, and that you have, as anyone who is watching television in multiple languages, folks in this conversation for whom English is not your first language, like I'm preaching to the choir in this, but having the subtleties and the multiple addresses is kind of an interesting thing. But what I actually also wanted to share is on the wiki.com platform, because it's fan subtitling. You have moments where there are footnotes in the subtitles as they go past, which is a practice that you will have seen 20 years ago with fan subs of anime, of explaining what does this honorific mean? Is this a particularly archaic way to say brother? And so are we like layering in some meaning there? So the Netflix subs come sort of fast and dirty and as cheap as possible, I expect. And then you have fan communities who might be subtitling the same shows because they're licensed on both platforms. And it can be really interesting. I'm not sure if there's a research project in it, but just as a way of consuming and interacting and trying to make sense of all of it, it's interesting to see how you have those differences and how they're packaged or not for an audience that is presumed to be interested enough or not in the cultural nuances.
Thank you. I think there's also something that in kind of like conversations around dubbing and subtitling. And obviously, I mean, English and Korean are not that culturally proximate. But at the same time, it's like, I mean, you hear faster than you can read. So subtitles aren't necessarily the best means of translation, even though dubbing also doesn't have the most stellar record in kind of what translation is, because translation, more or less by definition, is kind of a fluid practice. Because different languages. So I actually, because it's already 6:30, so I did want to kind of open up this discussion a bit more to any kinds of questions that anybody has, or any kind of comments on the discussions we've had among the contributors. So essentially anybody can just raise their hand now and comment or ask question. I'm still going to turn to Emir first.
Thank you. And you know, I just want to say also, I want to reiterate, it is so wonderful to have so many people who are interested in this topic together in one place, because while binge watching is very popular, I feel like the scholarship on it is still kind of spread out and sparse. So it's really nice to be in a Zoom conversation with so many people studying, you know, different aspects, but of a topic that is so important to me. I you know, out of this book, I you know, found, you know, reading your chapters, particularly ones outside of my section, which I hadn't obviously read during the review process, just to be so fascinating. And I had a question for Charlotte about your chapter. I'm currently working on a sort of a long journalistic history of binge watching and marathoning in the news. And one thing that I had a question about for you in terms of all that archival research that you did on those fanzines, and all those sort of letters being passed back and forth, you know, and do you have this tape and all that? What I'm wondering is, did those fans, did you get a sense, because I only read, you know, I only read the ones that you kind of quote for the article, but you read them all. So do they have a sense that they are kind of, in some ways, fighting against or getting the better of the sort of broadcast network structures of the sort of middle 20th century, which literally controlled when episodes came out and, you know, had, like when you could tune in and all those things, everything would flow. Did they sort of have a sense of empowerment baked into the way they were talking about that sharing and all that?
Not like an act of resistance. You know, classic film study, or sorry, classic fan studies tends to look at fan activity and frame it as like, this is resistance, this is taking control. Though that kind of overt framing isn't really there. I would probably need to go back in or direct you to the same archives I was using, just to look at it with that eye. What I did find occasionally were comments sort of criticizing the choice of the rerun, like, well, like, why are you showing that one? Or praising reruns because finally they can get a full tape set to then share with friends or to have for their own archive. And there was one fantastic discussion, I think in a Star Trek zine, about being a Nielsen family and how, like, just absolutely savaging the Nielsen methodology. Because sure, we can keep a diary for this week, but it's not a typical week for us. And if you truly want to know what we're like, you need to, like, and just absolutely destroying from an engaged audience perspective, this metric or this process of building a metric that they are quite conversant with, but not being an industry professional. So there are things like that throughout, which I guess it's not about we're making our own way, but and the other example is the one about the episode of Starsky and Hutch that wasn't aired in the UK until 16 years after that one convention. So in the letter, it doesn't say we're watching this because it's not available to watch in Swansea where the convention was. I had to find that out myself in doing the research. So, yeah.
No, I appreciate that. That is really helpful. Yeah, because I have found that in the sort of the press coverage, you know, maybe a decade or so later from when you were researching, there was this sort of baked in narrative of viewer empowerment that first started with DVDs. And then as streaming came along, this idea that these rebellious binge viewers were, you know, turning the industry on its head and et cetera, seemed to come out more and more in the press. But I was just curious if the actual proto binge viewers were feeling that way at all. And it sounds like maybe it wasn't as much in there. It's fascinating.
Part of it is that their activity seems to be coming out of a convention tradition. And there was always, or there had long been a film track at a Star Trek convention or a science fiction convention where they're just showing old films. So it's bringing an existing set of practices into a new frame rather than new resistance, I think.
Sorry, Hannah.
Hi. Thank you so much. This is such an interesting discussion and really great collaborators. And as someone who's kind of going through academia, I think it's really inspiring to see like a community kind of collaboration approach. I hope that there's more of that in the future. This is a question for Julia and also Tanya. And I'm not sure, Julia, you might address this in your upcoming book, but one thing I'm interested in is like I'm also looking at like representations of sexual violence and survivors and victims in TV. And I think the take on Unbelievable is really interesting, and this idea how because of the binge you get a more emphasized contrast between like how not to handle a case and how to approach a case and victims. But I was recently reading Karen Boyle's book on like Me Too, Weinstein feminism. And she made an interesting point where there is this like huge surge of these narratives coming out, and, you know, Netflix kind of frames itself as being this like feminist platform. but there is some sort of like, I guess, disconnect from like broader feminist movements. And she was just pointing that like, that while there's this awareness, like it doesn't really equate to, I guess, policy change. But I, you know, as someone who's really inspired by these series, I wonder, is there anything we can do as scholars to like try and marry these together? I don't know if this is making sense, but just to like, is there a way that we can look at them or analyze them or bring them together as a way that maybe does promote this broader change that I would hope to see in like the handling of like rape investigations and stuff like that. Anyways, thank you.
Yeah, Julia, go ahead.
Okay, I'm not on mute. No, not mute. Okay. Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Hannah. Thank you. And I think actually Tanya can speak to this probably much more detail because Tanya, your research really focuses on representation of sexual violence. I am kind of looking at more broadly at sort of representation of feminism and all sorts of so-called progressive politics on TV. But yeah, that's something actually I grappled with so basically just to sort of looking at behind the curtain and how the sausage was made. I was mostly working on the Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt chapter and part of our chapter, and Tanya was looking at Unbelievable, and which kind of, sorry?
You're revealing secrets here, Julia, but that's okay, go ahead.
Sorry. But yeah, so that's our big dirty secret. But we had lots of conversations about what we thought about these shows and how kind of, I don't know, the ethical issues, could we call that maybe, that how these shows that in their promotion, on their sleeve, are trying to say that yes, we are kind of critiquing rape culture. And I remember we had these kinds of conversations with you, Tanya, when I think it was about Unbelievable. Like, is it? So we basically were saying, or you were kind of your argument there was that the mode in which bingeability is here used is, excuse me, I have this dry cough, is basically a way to sort of critique past and so previous representations of rape, and how this basically show itself through binge watching tries to sort of critique this culture of not just rape, but sort of rape culture, but also representations of rape culture. And I remember that we had this sort of discussion about this moment, or very sort of brief moment in the show where, so basically it's a really important point in with the show, that rape it's such is never represented, never portrayed, never shown, unlike, and it's supposed to be kind of speaking back to, or talking back to such representations as Game of Thrones was much talked about at the time, still is, I guess, in that regard, in that frame, and critiqued. Excuse me. And we talked about how there is this point in Unbelievable when we don't see any kind of, so basically the idea is that this show was created with a kind of sort of respect toward the victims. Yet there was that moment when we have this sort of split seconds of those of you who have seen the show, you might remember these sort of photographs that the rapist was taking, and how it was, so basically it was so respectful not to show these photographs or any kind of upsetting depictions in the series, yet there were these sort of split seconds of it. And I was thinking that was actually a kind of have the cake and eat it too ethical moment of the show, a problematic ethical moment in the show. And we had this discussion around that, if you remember, Tanya, and then I'm still kind of on the fence about that. Like I'm not entirely happy with that. And I was thinking how about our own kind of approach as well as researchers to this stuff, which is obviously quite conflicted relationship. It's something that Sarah Projansky also talks about in her book on Watching Rape, how, as a feminist academic, you you know, she's, I think, posing this question of, am I not perpetuating rape culture if I am talking about this, even if critically? So I don't have an answer to that. Is where I come out. So that was my long-winded answer to which ends up in, I don't know. I'm still grappling with it, to be honest, in my current research as well.
Yeah, I think it's a very challenging question. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you for coming to this event. You're right. I mean, visibility does not equate to political change, does it? We have to be mindful of that. But there are so many representations now that are emerging of consent and consent culture, like that are trying to challenge rape culture, that I think are really interesting. And I am, for some strange reason, feeling a little bit optimistic at this moment. My other project is on intimacy coordination, and I'm looking at how like intimacy coordinators are working with actors to ensure that like off screen that they give consent to the depictions of intimacy that they're filming. And it's really interesting to think about how that relates to on-screen depictions of consent and intimacy that are different, that might be hopefully shifting the way that people think about sexuality. And I also do a lot of research in schools at the moment, and it's interesting to see how these shows are affecting young people and maybe shifting some of the ways that they think about like sex and consent and intimacy. So that's a bit hopeful of me. You've caught me at a hopeful moment. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Cynical. Sorry.
Oh, Marika, you're muted.
See, this happens when I mute myself. So thank you so much, both of you, for two not really opposing viewpoints, but obviously kind of like viewpoints we all seem to be moving through at various points. Especially when it comes to ideas of, and I'm going to broaden the perspective a little bit here, not just the kind of way Netflix formulates feminism, but I mean, you two also talk about the entire idea of formulating wokeness on Netflix. So there are obviously other issues that particularly for Netflix do come in, not just in relation to depiction of women and depiction of rape, but also in relation to the way that it deals with depicting racial diversity, or quite frankly, diversity of any kind. So broader gender diversity, moving beyond binaries, but also in depictions of disability, for example. Okay, are there any more questions? Okay. I also think quite a few people apparently need to leave really soon. What is everyone binge watching tonight? That's actually a good question. That might be a really good question to finish on, quite frankly. So what is everyone binge watching tonight? I'm on Gilmore Girls, quite frankly, because I'm at the point of the semester when I can't take in new stories anymore.
I'm going with Hacks.
With what?
Hacks.
Oh, Hacks.
Ah.
Hacks. Yeah, no, I mean, it's on, I think it's, yeah, I'm watching it on my TV on demand, but yeah, I mean, it was shown as a series, but I'm just like doing it as a binge. I'm going to finish it tonight.
Okay.
3
great.
episodes.
Bye, Barb. Excellent.
Barb?
She's gone. Barb's gone. I just said bye. Oh, Midnight Mass. Yeah, I did watch Midnight Mass. I don't usually watch horror, but I did watch that.
I watched a couple of episodes of that and then it annoyed me a lot. And I couldn't deal with new stories anymore.
Yeah. I'm not sure what I'm going to watch. Now I'm wondering if I should try the morning show season 2.
Big Mouth is a good one. Big Mouth is actually quite an interesting one. That's a good one as well.
I just realized that I'm recently watching weekly TV, so it's not really bingeable.
What are you watching?
Weekly TV. So
weekly TV, Succession.
Yeah. Succession, morning show.
Yeah.
Foundation, which is quite rubbish, but I still take my sci-fi.
Oh, I know what I want to watch. I want to start watching the most recent series of Insecure. That's what I'm going to do.
Ooh.
Love that show. Okay.
And I think this brings us all to our point, right? That we look at the catch up, repeat, like creating your own binge, right? Succession, Hacks from, all these different networks. So it's not just about binging what's being offered by the release model, right?
I think there's also another point which I always find quite interesting in terms of technology, because it's like I'm technically watching Succession too. I'm just waiting for the season to end. I did that with Ted Lasso as well with the second season, where I just waited and then binge watched. I'm waiting for morning show to end. So because I really, really like binge watching, it's the technology very much allows us at the moment to choose our own mode of viewing. And I think that's quite important too, also when we're thinking about these weekly release models, particularly Apple and Disney Plus.
Marika, as the world expert on binge watching, I want to know how many episodes in your personal world constitute.
That actually, no, it's like I actually found that is really, really dependent on life phases, because, when you're a student and you have lots of time and you just watch 6 episodes in a row or an entire season in a row, that would obviously, I think by any standard that kind of qualifies as a binge, but I also think that not all of us can do that. People with small children are usually happy when they can manage one whole episode. And I actually think that it's the subjective definitions of kind of what can you manage, what is perhaps to a certain extent excessive for you. I think that more or less determines what a binge is. I think what is probably quite important is that you essentially focus on one series at a time. Okay. So it's less about how many episodes do you watch, which is a subjective metric anyway, and more about how many series do you watch at a time. Which in a weekly release, you're more likely to watch 5 series at any time, because you have 5 days a week when you watch different episodes of different series.
That's it. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Orchin?
I just wanted to sort of get your opinions on something that I've started doing with the pandemic, and I was wondering if what everyone thinks about that. So I've started watching basically a weekly role-playing game. It's called Critical Role. You may have heard of them, especially with the latest Twitch thing. And the interesting thing is, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm actually binging it, but I am watching it weekly, but simply because every episode is between 4 to 7 hours. It's always a binge, even though I watch it weekly, because they're just, on a table playing a role play game, doing awesome adventures. So I was just wondering how that could be contextualized, I guess, it's almost like a hybrid form of something being weekly, but also being a binge, I guess, because it's just so much.
Isn't this why we sort of moving towards typologies? The different kinds of things. I mean, I feel like for a while, if something were live, if you're watching something live, even for a prolonged period of time, the original kind of definitions of binge watching wouldn't allow for that. No, it has to be something pre-recorded. If you just stared at a TV for a long period of time, that was, not binge watching. And I think that sort of expanded. So I think, there are different sort of subtypes within that need to be articulated. And I know just a group that can do that.
I think that's like also, I mean, the thing is that within these, I think the concept of typologies is also really, really useful here. I mean, the thing is that I would argue that for me, watching 8 hours of TV is not the same thing as binge watching, because you're not that focused on one media form or one TV series at a time. Meanwhile, if you're kind of like watching essentially a presentation of something over several days, I think that probably comes closer to that. Although, I mean, the thing is, like, obviously we have to be quite careful on all of these definitions, largely because obviously convergence is always happening as we speak, and we can only ever capture like individual moments of a discourse. Okay, any more questions or comments? Yeah, by the way, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the chat, like these kinds of like sports events like the Olympics. I mean, obviously that is kind of like probably the original binge in terms of kind of looking at all of these sports events, which to a certain extent, I guess, are like serial form as well.
Yeah, I've had this come up in interviews with viewers. If you're watching a tournament like the NCAA basketball tournament, March Madness in the US, which is huge, or the World Cup, I mean, it is a singular narrative that's reaching a climax, right? And it's, you want to find out what happens next, right? You keep going. There are little chapters that lead you along the way towards that finale. But I think a lot having to do with how Netflix first and streaming companies first sort of grabbed the term and used it for what they were doing. It sort of fell out of people's minds that could constitute. But if you look at the definitions that we've all articulated, that have been articulated about binge watching, a tournament would kind of fall into that, the parameters.
Yeah, although I think I think there's also something quite important in what Charlotte says in her article about the history of binge watching.
Yeah.
In terms of many things are binge watching. Of course, Netflix grabbed it and ran, and that's marketing. But obviously, binge watching happens in many different forms. And if we're conceptualizing it as I would as some sort of rogue audience practice, because throughout history, a lot of the time, binge watching has been something that audiences are not supposed to be doing, and and they're not supposed to want this, but they're doing it anyway, and they apparently want it anyway. And so obviously there are kind of like a lot of versions of viewing that aren't like in officially meaning commercially sanctioned version of binge watching, and Netflix is a commercially sanctioned version of it. Rob?
Oh yeah, I don't know whether it's just extending the point that was made about sports, but I've been doing some work on pro wrestling and as a sort of convergent medium, and I think that's picking up on the whole sports thing. That's a kind of interesting case study because it's both serialized fiction posing as sport, but it also exists as episodic television. But then you can, where is the boundary between binging that? If you watch an episode of the television, then kind of go into the social spaces where the storyline carries on. You're still consuming the fiction of the world, but it's sort of the lines between what is sanctioned as an episode or part of the fiction are completely blurred within that as a form. So I wonder if that's just got me thinking about like whether to do something on binge watching and pro wrestling to extend that type of.
Yeah, I think Benjamin Litherland has also been doing work on that as well.
Yeah. Oh, on binging specifically as with wrestling.
I think he also has done some work, or I think it's like in the context of his book, like there is binge watching is involved. Let's put it like that.
I'll check.
Okay, I think we're kind of at the end of our discussion. So I do really want to thank all of you for being here and for participating. And I want to thank everybody who kind of like participated in the discussion in the chat and paid attention, gave us the attention. I always think it sounds a bit cheesy, but thank you so much for your attention anyway. Yeah, I think with that, we're at the end here. And I'm gonna let you all get back to your day. For some of you, it's actually still in the mornings. So thank you so much. And
Ron, thank you. Thank you for organizing it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Okay.
Bye. Okay, bye everybody.